Think of a photograph from the 1930s. A family picnic on a summer's afternoon, a crowded street market filled with laughter, or a simple day at the beach. Now, imagine a swastika banner hanging in the background of that picture. For millions of Germans, this was their reality. Ordinary life, love, work, leisure, unfolded under the shadow of a regime that demanded loyalty, punished dissent, and reshaped every corner of society. This is not the story of Hitler the dictator or of generals on distant battlefields. It is the story of civilians, the men, women, and children who lived their daily lives under the Nazi regime. Some embraced the promise of order, others endured in silence, and many found themselves complicit, coerced, or corrupted. Tonight, we step into their world to understand not only what they endured, but how a modern society was transformed. One family, one neighbor, one street at a time. Berlin. Night. 1943. The air trembles before the blast. A siren wails, cutting through the blackness. Then the sky erupts, bombs raining down in sheets of fire. Streets vanish in a heartbeat, swallowed by the roar of destruction. Glass shatters, walls collapse, entire homes are torn apart. Inside a cramped apartment, a mother shields her children beneath the kitchen table. Plaster falls from the ceiling. A portrait of their father, away at the front, crashes to the ground. They cling to one another, praying the next hit will not be theirs. When the thunder of bombs finally fades, silence does not follow. A heavy knock echoes at the door. Not a neighbor, not a friend. The Gestapo. Terror came from the skies, but also from within. This was the life of civilians under Nazi rule. Survival demanded obedience, silence, and sacrifice. And as the world outside collapsed into flames, the question for every civilian was the same. How far would you go to live another day?
Germany in 1933 was not a land of triumph but of exhaustion. The scars of the Great War still ran deep. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the nation of land, pride, and security. Hyperinflation a decade earlier had reduced savings to worthless paper, and the Great Depression had left millions unemployed. Families queued in bread lines. Farmers abandoned fields. In Berlin, desperate men sold pencils in the street. Into this despair stepped a man who promised more than policies. He promised salvation. Adolf Hitler's rise was not only a political shift, it was an emotional tide. For civilians weary of instability, he offered something precious, the illusion of order. At rallies, ordinary Germans heard his words echo in colossal stadiums. They saw banners stretch across entire squares, torches burning in the night, crowds moving as one. For many, the sheer spectacle was overwhelming. The chaos of Weimar seemed to dissolve in those moments. It felt as if the nation had been reborn. But this promise of order came with a silent warning: it would not be shared equally. Within months of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, civil liberties evaporated. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave the Nazis the pretext they needed. The decree that followed suspended freedom of speech, of press, of assembly. Citizens read the newspapers, now censored, and felt the rules of daily life shifting beneath their feet. Newspapers no longer reported dissent. Radio broadcasts praised the new leadership. Street corners displayed posters demanding unity. To many, this was comforting. The fighting between communists and nationalists that had once spilled into streets seemed to vanish overnight. Children could walk to school without crossing barricades. Markets reopened. Work returned, thanks to rearmament and public projects like the Autobahn. But for others, life darkened swiftly. Communists and socialists were among the first targeted. Their offices raided, their leaders arrested. Dachau, the first concentration camp, opened in March 1933, holding political prisoners. Stories circulated of men vanishing after midnight knocks, never to be seen again. Civilians whispered, but most did not protest. Many told themselves it was necessary. Order had to be restored. The troublemakers had brought this on themselves. These phrases echoed at kitchen tables, in beer halls, in workplaces. For those who played along, life began to look brighter. By 1935, the regime introduced programs that made ordinary Germans feel cared for. Strength Through Joy offered subsidized vacations, cheap theater tickets, and the promise of a Volkswagen, a people's car for every family. Teachers spoke of Germany's great destiny. Farmers saw debts forgiven. For millions, the Nazis delivered what the Weimar Republic never could, a sense of stability. But beneath the calm surface, the foundation was built on fear. Civilians understood, even if silently, that this new order thrived because enemies of the state had been silenced. And so long as the victims were communists, socialists, or a neighbor who spoke too freely, most civilians looked away. Germany had been given its promise of order. And with it, a bargain: safety for conformity, silence for survival. Order, once established, was guarded not only by laws but by terror. The Gestapo, the secret state police, was not vast in number. At its peak, no more than 16,000 men policed a nation of over 60 million. But it did not need to be large. Its true weapon was fear, magnified by the civilians themselves. Denunciations poured in daily. A worker reported his colleague for muttering that the Führer was driving Germany into ruin. A schoolboy turned in his father for telling a political joke at the dinner table. A woman denounced her neighbor, motivated less by loyalty than by envy over a promotion or a personal quarrel. This was the genius of terror: it enlisted ordinary civilians as its agents. The Gestapo became omnipresent not because it was everywhere, but because it could be anywhere. No one knew who might be listening. Every word became dangerous. Imagine sitting in a cafe, lowering your voice as you whisper to a friend. Imagine glancing over your shoulder at the next table, unsure if that stranger with his newspaper might, in fact, be writing down your name. For millions, this was daily life. Once accused, the machinery moved quickly. Interrogations, prison, camps. Few returned. Those who did often carried the marks of torture and silence. Families learned not to ask too many questions. Even the home was not safe. Children, taught in classrooms to idolize Hitler and to despise traitors, sometimes repeated their parents' private conversations at school. Teachers, loyal to the regime, reported them onward. Fathers arrested because their sons had repeated an offhand remark. Mothers vanished because of a neighbor's suspicion. Fear reshaped civilian life in subtle ways. People laughed louder at jokes they did not find funny. They applauded speeches they did not believe. They saluted at every opportunity, their arms rising more out of instinct than conviction. It was not always the Gestapo who silenced dissent. It was the quiet knowledge that anyone, a colleague, a classmate, even a child, could become the accuser. And so, a nation learned the cruel arithmetic of survival: better to remain silent, better to look away, better to denounce before being denounced. The promise of order, so eagerly embraced in 1933, had transformed by 1935 into something darker. It was no longer enough to obey. One had to believe, or at least perform belief convincingly. In the world of fear, civilians lived in a constant state of watchfulness. And yet, life continued. Markets opened. Schools ran. Families gathered on Sundays. But beneath every ordinary moment, the knowledge lingered: one wrong word could end it all. Fear alone cannot sustain a regime. Terror may silence dissent, but belief creates loyalty. And the Nazi state understood that to secure its future, it needed not only obedience, but faith. Nowhere was this clearer than in the schools. Classrooms that once taught literature and science were refashioned into laboratories of ideology. Children opened textbooks filled not with neutral lessons, but with racial charts, Aryan measurements, and warnings about so-called degenerate peoples. Math problems asked them to calculate how much food was wasted on the disabled. History lessons glorified German victories, while erasing defeats. Teachers who resisted were dismissed, or arrested. Those who remained became instruments of indoctrination. And then came the youth movements. The Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, and the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls. At first, they seemed like harmless clubs, filled with camping trips, songs, and sports. But beneath the campfires and uniforms lay something more profound, a slow but relentless rewiring of loyalty. Children pledged oaths not to their parents, not to their God, but to Adolf Hitler himself. Week after week, millions of boys marched in step, chanting slogans, learning military drills, preparing for a life of war. Girls were taught a different creed: to serve as mothers, to bear the children who would carry forward the Reich. Their lives were molded into a single destiny: service to the state. At home, propaganda saturated daily life. Radios, subsidized so nearly every household could own one, filled the evenings with Hitler's speeches, martial music, and carefully crafted news reports. Newspapers, stripped of independent voices, printed only stories approved by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. Posters appeared on walls, in factories, in shops, depicting smiling Aryan families, heroic soldiers, and ever-present warnings about enemies within. Even entertainment was enlisted. Films like Triumph of the Will turned political rallies into cinematic spectacle. Comedies and romances slipped subtle messages about loyalty and sacrifice into their plots. Even children's books, once filled with fairy tales, now carried grotesque caricatures of Jews and warnings against racial impurity. It was not enough to fear the Gestapo. One had to see the world through Nazi eyes. Civilians were surrounded, immersed, enveloped in a culture where every sign, every broadcast, every classroom exercise reinforced the same message: Germany was reborn, Hitler was its savior, and those who did not belong were its enemies. Imagine being a child in that world. Your friends wear the same uniform. Your teacher speaks the same words. Your radio blares the same voice each night. The posters on the street confirm what you've been taught. And when you look at your parents, hesitant, cautious, you begin to wonder, are they as loyal as they should be? This was indoctrination not as an event, but as a constant, all-consuming rhythm of life. For civilians, especially the young, it blurred the line between truth and propaganda until the two became indistinguishable. And by the mid-1930s, belief was no longer optional. It was the air civilians breathed. To question it was to risk isolation. To resist it was to risk death. By the mid-1930s, Germany had become a nation divided. On the surface, civilian life for many Germans seemed to be improving. But that comfort existed only because others were being systematically excluded and destroyed. For the so-called Aryan majority, the rewards of loyalty were real. Families received cheap vacations through the Strength Through Joy program. Subsidized theater tickets, organized hiking trips, even cruises gave workers the sense that they were valued by the state. The promise of the Volkswagen, the people's car, symbolized a modern, prosperous future. New highways stretched across the landscape, monuments of progress that civilians could see with their own eyes. Many Germans told themselves life had never been better. Wages stabilized, unemployment plummeted, crime declined. It seemed, at least for those inside the circle of acceptance, that Hitler had restored dignity and purpose. But that circle excluded millions. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 formalized a racial divide that had already been growing. Jews were stripped of citizenship, forbidden from marrying or even associating with non-Jews. Doctors, lawyers, and teachers lost their right to practice. Shops owned by Jewish families were boycotted, their windows smeared with graffiti, Jew, un-German, enemy. Imagine a child walking to school, passing a store his family once visited every week. Now it is boarded up, its owner humiliated in the street. He sees his parents avert their eyes. He sees classmates whisper. Slowly, he learns what it means to be an outsider. And Jews were not the only ones pushed into the shadows. Interracial couples were denounced and separated. Those deemed racially impure were denied jobs, stripped of pensions, barred from public spaces. Friends who had once dined together no longer spoke in public. A neighbor's handshake could suddenly mark you for suspicion. The divide ran deeper still. While one family enjoyed a state-sponsored holiday, another was forced to sell their home at a fraction of its value, their belongings confiscated. While a factory worker proudly drove on the new Autobahn, Jewish families were forbidden even to own bicycles in some towns. It was a split-screen society. One half illuminated by propaganda posters of smiling children and strong workers, the other half plunged into fear, humiliation, and despair. What made this divide most chilling was its normalization. For many civilians, discrimination became background noise, the price of progress, the cost of belonging. The swastika hanging over the marketplace was no longer strange. It was ordinary. And so, a nation adjusted. Some looked away. Some cheered. And some, a growing minority, understood that their survival meant living with the knowledge that their neighbor's suffering was the foundation of their own comfort. The promise of privilege for some was built on the persecution of others. It was the unspoken bargain at the heart of civilian life in the Nazi state. When we think of Nazi persecution, we often think first of the Jews. But the machinery of exclusion and annihilation reached further, claiming civilians whose names are seldom remembered. The disabled, the Roma, homosexuals, political nonconformists, Jehovah's Witnesses. For the disabled, the danger came wrapped in the language of medicine. The program was called Action T4, named blandly after a Berlin address. Officially, it was framed as euthanasia, a mercy killing to spare the unfit from lives of suffering. But in truth, it was the first mass murder campaign of the regime. Doctors, men sworn to heal, signed forms that marked children and adults for death. Ambulances with shrouded windows carried them away to clinics where gas chambers masqueraded as showers. Families were told their loved ones had died of pneumonia or heart failure. In truth, more than 70,000 civilians with physical or mental disabilities were murdered between 1939 and 1941. The silence of ordinary civilians made it possible. Neighbors noticed when patients disappeared from asylums. They saw smoke rising from care institutions. Some whispered, but most said nothing. And when protests did erupt, from parents, from clergy, the killings moved underground, but they did not stop. The Roma, too, were marked as outcasts. Branded as asocials and racially inferior, entire families were rounded up, forced into camps, sterilized, or deported east. In city after city, caravans vanished from the streets, the music of Roma fiddles replaced by silence. By the war's end, as many as 500,000 Roma civilians would be murdered in the genocide they call the Parachmos, the devouring. Homosexual men lived in fear of denunciation. Paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, sharpened by the Nazis, criminalized their existence. Thousands were arrested, imprisoned, sent to camps where they were forced to wear pink triangles, targets for abuse not only by guards but by fellow inmates. Few survived. Jehovah's Witnesses were punished not for who they were, but for what they refused to do, salute Hitler. Their loyalty was to God alone, and for that defiance, they were jailed, tortured, even executed. Civilians who once saw them distributing religious pamphlets now watched them vanish into prisons and camps. And so, an entire spectrum of victims, disabled, Roma, homosexuals, the devoutly faithful, suffered in silence. Their persecution was quieter, less visible than the great public spectacles of anti-Semitism. But for them, life under Nazi rule was every bit as suffocating, every bit as deadly. The tragedy is not only that they were targeted. It is that they were forgotten, excluded from civilian life before being erased from existence. Their neighbors walked past empty homes, silent schools, shuttered businesses. And then they walked on. In the Nazi state, silence itself became a form of complicity. And it was this silence that allowed the machinery of death to evolve, expand, and prepare for something even greater. By the late 1930s, the rhythm of daily life in Germany had settled into a dangerous normality. For many civilians, the economy thrived. New highways crisscrossed the countryside, unemployment plummeted, and national pride seemed restored. Children marched in Hitler Youth parades, while their parents applauded from sidewalks lined with swastika flags. But beneath this surface of order, the storm clouds gathered. The Nazi regime was not content with control at home, it demanded expansion abroad. Rearmament accelerated. Factories once producing plows now built tanks. Workers, many of them civilians once unemployed, labored long hours under slogans of sacrifice for the fatherland. The mood was tense. Some whispered about another war, recalling the trauma of 1914. But others reassured themselves, Hitler promised peace even as he prepared for conquest. Civilians clung to the illusion that the Reich's ambitions could be fulfilled without bloodshed. And then came November 9, 1938. Kristallnacht. The night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, violence exploded. Nazi paramilitaries, often joined by ordinary civilians, smashed the windows of Jewish shops, looted businesses, burned synagogues, and beat Jewish neighbors in the streets. Firefighters stood by, instructed only to prevent flames from spreading to Aryan property. The streets were littered with glass, glittering like ice in the moonlight, 1,000 shattered windows reflecting a nation's complicity. For Jews, it was a turning point. Until then, persecution had come in laws, boycotts, exclusions. Now it arrived with fire and fists. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested, dragged into concentration camps. Families huddled in terror, realizing that the hostility they once thought survivable had become lethal. And for the wider civilian population, the reactions were varied. Some cheered. Some watched in silence. Some, a small, quiet few, were horrified, but dared not intervene. Fear, propaganda, and opportunism had fused. A nation that had once prided itself on culture and intellect now stood amid burning synagogues, as neighbors were driven out like criminals. Kristallnacht revealed the truth: the divide between privilege and persecution was no longer abstract. It was written in broken glass and human suffering. And yet, life for most Germans resumed the next morning. Workers went to factories. Children went to school. Markets reopened. The shards of glass were swept away, but the message lingered: the storm had arrived. In the years that followed, the tempo quickened. Austria was annexed. Czechoslovakia dismantled. Civilians celebrated each triumph with parades and flags, reassured by propaganda that Germany's destiny was unfolding. Few asked what these victories meant for the future. By 1939, as Hitler prepared to invade Poland, Germany was no longer merely a nation under dictatorship. It was a society mobilized for war. Civilians stood at the center of a machine that demanded sacrifice, rewarded conformity, and punished dissent with merciless efficiency. The coming storm would not only engulf Europe's battlefields. It would transform every German household, every street, every civilian life. September 1, 1939. The roar of German artillery opened fire on Poland. Within days, Europe was at war again. For civilians in Germany, the news arrived with a strange mixture of dread and euphoria. Crowds cheered in public squares, waving flags as propaganda promised swift victory. Many remembered the humiliation of 1918 and told themselves, this time would be different. At first, it was. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, brought rapid triumphs. Poland fell in weeks. By the spring of 1940, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France were conquered. Civilians read newspapers filled with headlines of victory. Radio broadcasts spoke of Germany's invincibility. For a time, it felt as if Hitler had fulfilled his promise of greatness. But war also crept into everyday life. The rationing began: bread, meat, sugar, clothing. Families lined up with ration cards, carefully measuring out their weekly allowances. Farmers were ordered to deliver quotas. Housewives were praised as soldiers of the home front, urged to stretch meals, recycle clothing, and waste nothing. Posters declared, "Every sacrifice is a victory." In factories, the hours grew longer. Men too old for the army and women not yet conscripted into full war service were pressed into labor. Production lines churned out weapons, tanks, and aircraft. Civilians who once built cars or stoves now worked under the constant pressure of wartime quotas. The illusion of normality persisted. Cinemas remained open, playing films that mixed escapist romance with subtle propaganda. Children continued in school, though increasingly drilled in military exercises. Public concerts and sporting events carried on, but always with the shadow of war in the background. Yet for many civilians, especially in the early years, the war did not feel like loss. There were no bombs falling on Berlin, no enemy armies at the gates. Victories abroad gave the illusion of security at home. Soldiers wrote letters back from Paris, Warsaw, Oslo, describing victories that civilians could only imagine. And so, many civilians told themselves, perhaps this war would bring glory, not ruin. But the cracks were already showing. Rations tightened as the war dragged on. Coffee was replaced with bitter substitutes. Leather shoes gave way to wooden soles. Families learned to stretch one egg across 3 meals. Black markets thrived, but only those with connections or money could afford them. And then there were the silences. Casualty lists began to appear in newspapers, long columns of names, fathers and sons who would never return. Telegrams arrived at doorsteps, delivered by solemn officials. Grief entered German households quietly, steadily, in waves that grew heavier each month. For Jewish civilians, life grew unbearable. Forced labor, confiscated businesses, yellow stars sewn onto clothing. Each measure tightening the grip of exclusion. Neighbors who had once looked away now crossed the street to avoid them. Ordinary civilians, whether through fear, opportunism, or indoctrination, became bystanders, and sometimes participants, in their persecution. By 1941, the war had expanded eastward into the Soviet Union. The demands on civilians multiplied, more rationing, more labor, more sacrifice. Propaganda urged them to endure, to believe that Germany's destiny was unfolding. But beneath the slogans and the triumphs, an unease began to grow. For the first time, German civilians were beginning to understand that this war was not a passing storm. It was a total war, and it would consume every corner of their lives. By 1942, the illusion of safety had ended. The war no longer lived only in newspapers or distant letters from the front. It arrived in the skies above German cities. The sirens came first, piercing, unrelenting, a sound civilians learned to fear in their bones. Then, the low hum of engines, growing louder until it seemed the sky itself would collapse. And finally, the bombs. Explosions that turned night into fire, homes into rubble, and streets into graveyards. Hamburg, July 1943. Operation Gemara. In just 1 week, Allied bombing created a firestorm so intense it consumed the oxygen itself. Families suffocated in shelters. Entire streets melted into rivers of flame. More than 40,000 civilians were killed. Survivors described the horror of walking past piles of charred bodies, the smell of burning flesh hanging in the air for days. Dresden, February 1945. Once a jewel of art and culture, the city became an inferno. Tens of thousands of civilians, refugees, children, the elderly, perished in a storm of fire and smoke. Witnesses recalled the sky glowing red as far as the eye could see, the heat so fierce it sucked people into the blaze. For civilians, life became a cycle of fear and endurance. At the sound of sirens, families rushed to basements or crowded air raid shelters, clutching what few possessions they could carry. Children learned to sleep in their coats, ready to run at any moment. Mothers carried small bags with documents, photographs, and a little bread, the fragments of a life they hoped to save. And when the bombing ended, a different nightmare began. Streets were unrecognizable, homes reduced to skeletons of brick and ash. Families searched desperately through rubble for loved ones, for scraps of furniture, for anything that could be salvaged. Children were evacuated from cities, sent to the countryside through programs meant to protect them. For some, it was safety. For others, it meant years of separation from parents they would never see again. Hunger gnawed constantly. Rations grew thinner. Coal for heating ran out in winters. Civilians tore up furniture for firewood, scavenged for potatoes, traded heirlooms for bread. The once proud image of a thriving Reich crumbled into daily survival. Yet, even as bombs fell and cities burned, propaganda continued to demand faith. Radios told civilians that Germany would endure, that final victory was near. Posters declared, "Total war is the shortest war." But civilians knew better. Each raid, each telegram announcing another soldier's death, each funeral deepened the despair. By 1944, most civilians no longer asked whether the war could be won. They asked only how much more they would be forced to lose before it ended. Life in the shadow of bombs was not just destruction. It was a slow unraveling of ordinary humanity. Families reduced to ash. Streets emptied of children. Cities turned into cemeteries. For civilians, the war was no longer fought in distant trenches. It was fought in their kitchens, in their shelters, in the ruins of their homes. And by 1945, Germany itself stood on the edge of collapse. By 1945, the German Reich was collapsing. Not with parades and banners, but with hunger, rubble, and despair. Civilians, once promised glory and prosperity, now wandered through the ruins of a nation brought to the brink of annihilation. Starvation became a daily reality. Bread rations shrank to crumbs. Potatoes were rare. Families boiled weeds for soup, scavenged fields for turnips, or traded wedding rings for a handful of flour. The black market flourished, but only for those with something left to barter. For the poor, there was nothing but hunger. Millions of refugees crowded the roads. Families from East Prussia and Silesia fled before the advancing Red Army, dragging carts piled with whatever possessions they could carry. Mothers clutched children in freezing snow, old men collapsed by the roadside. Columns of exhausted civilians stretched for miles, a tide of desperation moving westward. Fear was everywhere. Rumors spread of atrocities committed by advancing Soviet soldiers, some true, others exaggerated. But all terrifying. Civilians boarded up windows, hid in basements, prayed they would be overlooked. For women especially, the end of the war brought not safety but new horrors, mass sexual violence that scarred survivors for life. In cities, the bombings continued until there was almost nothing left to destroy. Streets became mountains of brick and ash. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Children played in ruins because there was nowhere else left. And yet, the propaganda did not stop. Even in April 1945, as Soviet shells fell on Berlin, loudspeakers urged civilians to fight to the last man, woman, and child. Boys as young as 12 were handed rifles and ordered to defend their streets. Posters declared victory or death. But most civilians no longer believed. They were too tired, too broken. Some obeyed out of fear. Others simply hid and waited for the inevitable. Suicides multiplied. Families, convinced that defeat meant worse than death, poisoned themselves together. Hitler Youth boys, raised on loyalty to the Führer, shot themselves rather than surrender. In towns across Germany, the silence of death became the final protest against a regime that had demanded everything. When Allied forces arrived, Americans from the West, Soviets from the East, they found civilians gaunt, dazed, wandering through ruins like ghosts. Some greeted the soldiers with relief, offering white flags made from bedsheets. Others cowered in fear of revenge. And then, the truth began to emerge. Civilians who claimed ignorance of the camps saw the emaciated survivors stumbling out of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The smell of death could not be denied. The photographs, the corpses, the testimonies revealed what silence had hidden. The Reich had promised its people order, prosperity, and destiny. Instead, it had delivered rubble, hunger, and guilt. The collapse of 1945 was not only military, it was moral. And civilians, whether complicit, coerced, or corrupted, were left to live with the wreckage. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were ash and rubble. Millions were dead or displaced. But the collapse of the Reich was more than physical. It was a reckoning with silence, complicity, and conscience. In the months after the war, civilians emerged from basements and cellars, blinking into the daylight of defeat. For the first time, they faced the devastation not only of their homes, but of their illusions. They had lived under a system that demanded loyalty, punished dissent, and rewarded obedience. Some had embraced it. Many had endured it. Too few had resisted it. The Allies forced civilians to confront what the regime had concealed. Films of liberated camps were shown in town squares. Survivors, skeletal and broken, testified to horrors beyond imagination. Civilians claimed ignorance. We did not know, we could not see. But the silence of years spoke louder than words. And yet, amid the ruins, there were those who tried to rebuild. Families who had lost everything began again with nothing. Children grew up amid rubble, learning lessons their parents had never dared to teach. The scars of the Nazi years remained, etched into memory and conscience, carried in silence across generations. To live as a civilian under Nazi rule was to exist in a world of bargains, conformity for safety, silence for survival, belief for belonging. It was a world where ordinary lives were twisted by fear, propaganda, and persecution. A world that showed how quickly civilization can fracture, and how dangerous silence can be. The story of civilians under Nazi rule is not just about the past. It is about us, about how we respond to power, fear, and injustice in our own time. If history teaches us anything, it is this: silence is never neutral. So I ask you, in a world like that, would you stay silent, or would you stand up? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next chapter of history. Because remembering is not enough. It is only by carrying these lessons forward that we can hope to keep them from happening again.